Hello, and welcome to today's episode of 9 to 5 Wellness. So, today's topic is very near and dear to me because I really think that this is something we don't talk about often, which is longevity and its connection to performance. So, we all kind of are at this point familiar with athletes and how they have a very performance-oriented training regimen, but we often don't realize that actually the same metrics can also be used for increasing our health span. So I am excited about the topic today because both performance training and longevity training, they are connected, they're linked with physical and cognitive capacity at older ages. Performance actually directly promotes healthier, longer life. So high-level fitness metrics, when we look at them, especially when we talk about cardiorespiratory fitness, cardiovascular fitness, and strength, right? So they both predict superior athletic capability, but they also are a big marker for reduced mortality. So that's what we are going to dive into today. And I'm super excited because today I have an expert exercise professional with us. And he has been working in the exercise industry for a very long time. And he's going to share all the good stuff with us. And I always like to nerd out with fellow exercise professionals, of course, right? So our guest today is Lucas Denham. He is a movement professional, passionate about human connection. He specializes in creating connection through behaviors that also improve physical and mental well-being. He has extensive experience as sports performance coach and as a clinical exercise physiologist. Welcome to the podcast, Lucas.
Thanks, Aisha. It's a pleasure to be able to chat with you today.
Yeah, I'm super excited because I normally am like chatting with either healthcare practitioners and or physicians and sometimes HR professionals on the show. And so I'm excited when fellow exercise professionals come in, and especially in your case, exercise physiologist. You and I have a lot of parallels in our careers. So I want to dive right into this topic. And I think a lot of times longevity, what do we mean when we say to someone, hey, I think you should strive for longevity, or, and I know it's like a buzzword at this point, but I think a lot of people don't understand it. So for the sake of our listeners, I want to start with the basics. How do you define longevity?
Sure. Longevity, historically, I think would be referencing extending lifespan and extending maybe the years of your life, and looking at common diseases and common we expect to see, and trying to figure out with our predictive models how to prolong those diseases and how to help you live a longer life. Now, I think maybe the way you and I think about this could be a little bit different. We think of the term health span, which gets thrown out there quite a bit. And I'd say the difference between health span and longevity is looking at the quality of life versus the quantity of life, the delta of where the decline happens and how to extend the high quality. And maybe another way to phrase that is the difference between surviving and thriving. And we're trying to mitigate that delta and allow you to thrive as long as possible.
Absolutely. So having more life in your years, right? So that would be like the health span, and then having a longer life is normally what longevity is associated with. But what we are striving for is like a merger of the two, where you are able to acts of daily living, of course, like, you're functional, but also you're able to do stuff that you're passionate about, right? So if someone likes to golf, we want you to be able to golf in your marginal decade. And marginal decade is like the last years of your life, right? So we want you to be able to enjoy that. We want you to be able to run with your grandkids, go to their graduation, You go to their, wedding and whatnot. So that's great. Okay. We did touch upon health span. And as I just mentioned, health span and longevity can have a merger, right? What are a few performance markers that we look for in order to have a long health span that aligns with your person's long life?
Sure. Yeah, there's a few that have gained some popularity more recently in a widespread way that have been very popular in the exercise science world, particularly on the clinical side and the rehabilitation side. That's where we see the emergence of tests like the VO2 Max. We see grip strength, mainly using a dynamometer, but surely a multitude of different strength and power assessments. We look at body composition with DEXA, and we look at a few different ways to look at your quality of movement, your mobility, your stability, your ability to create different shapes and patterns in a way that's conducive to those functional tasks that we would expect to be able to do as we age.
Yeah, absolutely. DEXA scan, where we are looking at the body composition because it's a gold standard for body comp, gives us T-score, abilities I believe they do or the means do. And then thing would be bone mineral density, right? So that too. That's a pretty good into what's going on inside our bodies. So we have to look at visceral fat. We are able to look at your fat percentage. We are able to look at muscle mass. And of course, ideally, we want higher muscle mass for both men and women. Of course, there are healthier ranges of fat percentages too that we want you guys to have. And we can, sometimes talk about it, like what those are. I don't remember all the percentages on top of my head, but for women, it's mostly about 15 and 20% is where we are looking at. That's a very ideal range. And I've seen women who are very healthy and have a healthy lifestyle and healthy muscle mass and who are at 23% fat percentages, and they look really good. I love the way how you brought in grip strength too. Why do you think grip strength is so important?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think grip strength is meant to be a proxy for the overall health of your neuromuscular system. So when we look at grip strength, we're not only assessing the muscle mass, but we're looking at the software that controls that muscle mass. So we're not only looking at how much force you can generate, but how quickly you can generate it, how well you can send signals from your brain and your nervous system to that tissue. So maybe a lack of a better analogy, we're looking at the hardware and the software when we do a test like grip strength. Now, I think some people maybe interpret grip strength to be very literal and they'll train specifically for grip. And there's surely a lot of value to having a strong grip. And you want to be able to open jars and hold onto railings if you fall. But it's meant to be more so a proxy for total body strength, which we know that's ultimately important. And I'm sure we'll talk about other ways to assess that or patterns that we'd look. But generally, the grip strength is a really fast and easy way to get a snapshot of your overall force capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Grip strength actually is, I love the analogy you gave, like it's the software and the hardware associated with it. So it's giving you look into what's happening in the hardware. And it kind of like ties in with your muscular strength too. I want to expand on that a little bit because it's giving us an idea of how strong your muscles are just in general. So how much force you're able to produce. In exercise science world, we look at the watts that a human can produce, and that's like the power output. So we are no different than other machines or cars, right? You go and buy a car, you're always looking at, does it have a V8 engine? We're always comparing if it's a V6 engine versus V8. Why? Because it's going to generate more horsepower. Same way, our body and our muscles also produce and generate a lot of power. But then how much is their ability to produce that power? Grip strength is a very good indicator of that. Yeah, so that's great. Okay, let's talk about cardio because I know people love doing cardio and I have nothing against it because I think it has its place in this whole longevity equation. When we talk about training for capacity, because we just touched on strength, right? Grip strength, and we talked about the muscle mass, right? So they're both related to your strength, body strength. The other thing that we also want to look at is other end of the spectrum is training for capacity, which is like aerobic based. Again, it's part of your engine, your aerobic engine. What are we looking at there? How do we measure it?
Yeah. So, maybe we can take a step back and think of the history of this test, this VO2 max test that's now very popular. And we see videos of people with a mask running on a treadmill. And this has been
scary.
Pretty cool at the same time. I think that, as you know, this has been a very, very popular test in niche communities for 50 plus years in the endurance world. And this is kind of the golden child of exercise science as a field. Really was built around this test because at some point we found a rise in your VO2 max would lead to better performance. So a lot of endurance athletes really started to look at this metric and find ways to improve it. Because we have 50 years of data on it, now we've got enough where we can look at longitudinal studies that look at athletes' VO2 max and look at how long they live, look at when they get certain diseases. And we have found that of all the tests and all the data we have, this one does have a very strong correlation between your VO2 max and how long we could predict that you live a high quality life. So I think that's how it started to emerge in this longevity space. This is very much built around athletes, and now it's one of these traits that we see transcending into the widespread realm. With the VO2 max test, simply put, what we're looking at is the capacity of your aerobic system. So we're looking at how much oxygen you can take in and how much oxygen you can actually utilize during intense exercise. Assuming most people take in the same amount of oxygen on a breath in, those tests look at the content of the oxygen in your exhale. So the mask and the machinery connected to the mask captures samples of the breath that you're blowing out. We see how much oxygen is still left in that, and we can deduce how much you're actually consuming versus blowing back out. Now, I'm sure a lot of your listeners might remember in biology class, the mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell. So some of what we're looking at the cellular level is the health and the quantity of your mitochondria, like the infrastructure for allowing you to use oxygen during exercise. Some VO2 max tests, and sometimes this is done with a different test, but they also look at how effective you can operate in different pathways of your metabolism. So maybe a helpful analogy here is imagine your cardio or your metabolism as a hybrid vehicle. We look at how long you can run on the engine, where you start to switch to run on the battery, where you start to switch to burning gas, and how smooth that transition is. In a fancy term, we call that substrate utilization. We look at how well you can oxidize fat as a fuel source, and at what intensity your body starts to switch gears and start burning carbohydrates. So in a VO2 max test, we get a lot of useful data points that we can use as predictive models for your health span. Not only your VO2 max, your maximum heart rate, we can also look at how effectively you're able to use different fuel sources at different intensities.
Absolutely. Yeah. Doing that VO2 max test with the mask on, it has a lot of value because you start understanding just the fuel sources better too, especially when you're doing a cardio activity like running, biking, swimming. Those are the three major ones, although rowing is there too. That being said, at very, very high intensities, you are primarily burning carbohydrates. And if you do that test, you'll see like towards the end when, the intensity of the test becomes really high because the incline goes up. It's an incline-based test. Most of the facilities do Bruce protocol. So that being said, that the incline keeps on progressively getting higher, you're going to start seeing if you have a metabolic cart attached that, oh, wow, I started burning carbohydrates in the last 3 or 4 minutes. That's all I burn. So that then kind of starts giving you perspective as in what should you be eating, right? There's this whole, I want to say like noise around, oh, cut all the carbs out. Oh, just be fat adapted. Or just eat protein and nothing else. And that's not really what your body needs because our body needs all three macronutrients functioning, right? And at lower intensities is where we see that a high rate of fat being burned. So people who run primarily in aerobic zones, we are talking about ultra endurance athletes, right? People who compete in Ironman, Iron Women competitions, and or ultra runners. Now they are very fat adapted, but naturally, it's not that they're not never like eating anything other than fat. They might eat higher percentages of vegetarian sources of fat, but they're also eating carbs. They're also eating protein because the whole body functions like that. So I wanted to tie that in. Thank you so much for actually mentioning that. I do want to talk about VO2 max because I think it's true that it's kind of like recent that it has been kind of tied into or brought into the healthcare circle. We did that with the cardiorespiratory rehab patients, the testing, to some extent. And then it was very, very, very common over the last 2 decades among athletes, right? We want to know our athletes' endurance capability. And the only way to measure that has always been like VO2 max testing. So what's this athlete's advantage over here that we are talking about connected to VO2 max?
Yeah, that's where I think it's really interesting to see so many people interested in this besides athletes, because maybe it's also important to think about why does this matter for longevity and why does this matter for health span? And I think when we're thinking about tasks we want to be able to do, it's easy to think of the things we enjoy doing and we want to continue to do, but maybe the more difficult thing to think about is the things that are unpleasant that we don't want to do. Those kind of one-off scenarios, like your car breaks down and you got to walk several hours to get help. That's where you want to make sure you're well fat adapted so you can get through that. Or on the other end of the spectrum, if you need to sprint to go get help or do something that's very high intensity in a short burst, that's where we want to make sure you also have a big enough engine to be able to support that type of activity. So the athlete's advantage is they often have this flexibility where they've got both of those pathways well developed and they're able to toggle from one to the next. And it's great to be fat adapted. And on the other end of the spectrum, we see a lot of weightlifters, and I compete in the sport of powerlifting. So you can imagine cardio is not super popular with that group of people. They're very good at burning glucose and very good at pushing high intensities. But if you get them to do something low intensity for a long time, they struggle with it because they're not as well fat adapted. So it's surely useful in a performance lens to be maybe at one end of those spectrums, but good, well-rounded athletes and healthy aging individuals have this, what we call metabolic flexibility, where they can toggle, they can shift from end to end of that spectrum and be able to utilize both pathways effectively.
Yeah, no, I really like that. Thanks for highlighting metabolic flexibility. Can you expand on that a little bit more? I like the direction we are going into because I think a lot of people are not really that familiar with metabolic flexibility. We talked about fat, we talked about glucose or carbohydrates being burned. Within our body, it's burned in the form of glucose, the blood glucose that we have. Metabolically flexible athlete and or person, what edge do they have? What are they doing?
Yes, so they have this ability when you're working at a variety of intensities. If you're playing a sport like tennis, for example, where there's short bursts and sprints, and then there's times where you're a little bit lighter on your feet and you're recovering, you want to have the ability to toggle between those different fuel sources so one doesn't completely deplete. So if I'm doing a high intensity burst, I want to be able to switch gears and start to burn more glucose. And then during my rest periods, I want to be able to switch back to burning fat. And that's where if you lack that flexibility, we see this often on VO2 max tests where someone's really good at burning fat for a while, and then they hit a certain point where there's an on-off switch. There's not a lot of overlap where all of a sudden they just switch gears and it's hard to go back to the other. So you want to have this ability to toggle back and forth. So that way, if your carbohydrates start to get depleted, your body can switch back to burning fat. Your fats start to get depleted or too slow for the tasks, you can switch to burning carbohydrates. So that flexibility is also a key. It also helps guide exercise recommendations. So if you do a VO2 max test and you ask me what type of cardio is going to be the most useful based on what we see in this test, let's say you have a high VO2 max, but you have a low fat oxidation, we can say, hey, maybe this zone 1 and zone 2 type of exercise is going to develop that quality. Or maybe on the other end, if you're really good at burning fat, but you get to a certain point where you're just less efficient, then we can talk about maybe higher intensity cardio to develop the other end of the spectrum. So I think it's useful for guiding your exercise and giving you some direction when you go to work out, what kind of intensity, what kind of duration is going to be useful here. And you can come with a very customized approach if you have that data from a VO2 max test.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I really like it how you just broke down the metabolic flexibility and then also how we can actually use that data to now extrapolate it to your training program, to that athlete's training program. Every person, like even the patients who come to me, they're my athletes. So I'm just used to saying athletes, to that person's training program. So yeah, there's a threshold for each one of us, which is unique to us as individuals, where you're burning fat, and then you go into that 50% fat, 50% carb burn rate, and then at a point comes where your body's like, okay, I can't rely on fat. Fat is very slow. It takes a long time to break down fat. I can't rely on it anymore because I'm getting tired. The body's getting tired. The muscles are getting tired. The brain is like, we need this energy very, very fast. And then the brain is like, okay, let's switch. Let's switch to the glucose in your muscles. Your liver also provides some amount of it. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into the training protocol, because I think I get this question a lot on my social media platforms, especially on Instagram with the DMs that, okay, what do I do? How do I improve my VO2 max? So that is question number one, because I think there are a few parts to it, because we brought in the zones, which is great. I want to talk about the zones. How does someone who is not fat adapted, what are we talking about when we are talking about, okay, go and do more cardio activity in zone 1, zone 2? And what does it mean if someone is highly fat adapted and it's not kind of like serving their goal? They're not ultra endurance athletes, and they're like, well, how come I couldn't stay there once I hit that threshold? Why couldn't I keep on burning glucose for a little bit longer? Like, I want to extend that time frame. So let's go over that training protocol. I would love to know what you recommend.
And I'm really glad you brought this up, because a lot of people get this VO2 max test done and they get their results, and then that's kind of where the conversation ends, and they're like, okay, I don't really know what to do with this now. So I think it is really useful to talk about, okay, what to actually make of that data and how to change your exercise accordingly. And I think zone 2 is, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard of this. It's a very popular term now. And zone 2, when we say this, maybe I can give you a more generalized explanation and then maybe a more technical one. But generally speaking, zone 2 is that intensity that's just before that threshold that Aisha talked about, of where you're starting to switch gears and where your body's a little bit less effective at burning fat. And people have the ability to look at lactate thresholds and lactate testing. That's definitely a more scientific approach to this, but maybe an easier one that doesn't require as much technology is, it's often around that point where you could breathe through your nose, and all of a sudden you get to a certain intensity where I can't breathe through my nose anymore, and I start to change the way I breathe through breathing through my mouth. And if you look at that, it's actually quite aligned. We call it a ventilatory threshold. It's often very close to that lactate threshold as well. So there's surely an objective and a subjective way to figure out where this is. But to your original question, if we find that someone's VO2 max is less than what it should be, or less than what we would want it to be, to see that they're not going to see significant decline as they age, then we can figure out, okay, how do we build this VO2 max up with what types of intensities? If they're well fat adapted, they're able to do a lot of long intensity cardio without fatiguing. You could go for an hour straight and not feel like you're getting very tired. Then I would say maybe we need to get some exposure to that high intensity work where your body's less effective. You're starting to switch gears and burn glucose. And a lot of times that's going to be hard effort for short durations. So this is where protocols like high intensity interval training, short bursts, high intensity, where you're getting your body up to a really high heart rate, maybe not for a very long time, then you're backing off, letting your body recover. And your objective is to accumulate more time in that intense end of the spectrum of your cardio. On the other end, if like folks like myself with a weightlifting background, maybe we feel like we can thrive at that really high intensity zone. But if you asked us to just walk on an incline treadmill for an hour, it's like very difficult to do that. Those are the folks that could probably benefit from more of that zone 2 training. You could do more general step count throughout your day, maybe things that don't even feel like exercise. Once a week, you could throw in some hiking for longer periods of time, maybe a long bike ride. The goal is create balance so you feel comfortable in both that long duration and short duration but high intensity type of cardio.
Yes, I love these training options. And normally, yes, we would recommend like high intensity intervals just in general to improve the VO2 max too, because if you do higher intensity work in intervals, because the amount of force that you're going to be putting in the first round is going to be very different than your 8th round or 7th round, right? So it kind of already has this built-in mechanism where you're going to be training that low-end intensity and then high-end intensity as well. So thank you for actually bringing that in and mentioning that. The other thing you just mentioned was like if someone is a power athlete, like such as yourself, and I do powerlifting too, but I'm also an endurance athlete. So I try to be flexible. I don't know how much, but I try. That being said, with the low intensity work, I love the recommendations of hiking. I love the recommendation of all the powerlifters I've ever worked with. They have always told me, okay, get your 12,000 steps in every single day. And I'm like, don't worry about it. Like I just went for a 4-mile run today, so I'm good. But I also feel like there is a place for people who enjoy like those high intensity workouts, but also are able to do longer interval trainings, like longer aerobic intervals. Because what I find is a lot of powerlifters and or just people who love strength training, which is amazing, really. It's really good for your health. It's good for longevity. And you should be doing what you enjoy doing, right? But the biggest obstacle whenever I ask them, hey, why don't you bike for 20 minutes twice a week? Or why don't you just go for a quick jog twice a week? And the thing is, they're like, 20 minutes is a long time for us. We get bored or something, we just don't enjoy it. And of course, their body is just not adapted to it too. So of course you're not going to enjoy it. But I came across this research study recently where they said that if an athlete does 5 or 6 minute interval and then takes aerobic interval training and then just takes a couple of minutes off and then gets back into it, just like we would do high intensity interval, but it would be a longer time frame of the interval and stay in the aerobic zone, that is as effective as doing a continuous training. And the time frame that they looked at was 25 to 30 minutes of aerobic intervals.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think HIIT training it's a big umbrella term and it's hard to understand. And I think for people that have been in the fitness world, they've had exposure. A lot of times things like Tabatas come to mind where it's super high intense, really short. But it's still important to understand that if you're looking for aerobic adaptations, they should be long enough where you're actually using your aerobic metabolism. If it's 20 seconds as hard as you can possibly go, you're going to be definitely using an anaerobic source of energy, something that's probably already developed if you're doing resistance training. So the novelty of doing a 2-minute, 3-minute, 4-minute long interval where you can't muscle it the whole time, you still have to find your breath and a little bit more aerobic. I think that's also, to your point, arguably more useful for folks that have been more on the strength side of the equation to use than something that's just an all-out sprint.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for actually mentioning that, because I think there's a whole spectrum. And mostly when we're talking about HIIT, people are thinking, okay, it's 20 seconds, all out. It's a 100-meter sprint and that's it. Give it all, your all. And yeah, it has such a wide spectrum. Talking about intervals, is there a go-to protocol that you give your patients or clients or athletes you work with? So I've been recommending Norwegian protocol, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. What is your a go-to protocol for VO2 max improvement?
Yeah, there's surely a lot of research behind this 4x4 type of protocol. And if we look at some Swedish and Norwegian athletes, have had some of the highest recorded VO2 maxes. So I think a lot of this was reverse engineering and seeing like, okay, who has the highest VO2 max and what type of training are they doing? And they found that this is a pretty common protocol used by these athletes of 4 minutes of pretty high effort cardio, about 4 minutes rest, give or take, and repeat that for 4 rounds. And that's surely a very effective way to build your VO2 max. But I'll give the disclaimer that it's a lot harder than we're making it sound. I mean, this is something that if you enjoy that type of intensity and you've got an athlete's mindset where you're embracing being uncomfortable, this is surely the way to go. But if you're just getting into exercise, I often say, let's start a little shorter. Think like 2 minutes on, 2 or 3 minutes off, something where it's hard, but you're not going to completely gas yourself out on the first round. Some of the research I've looked at recently is looking at, okay, what's the optimal total time in that high intensity zone 5 type of pace throughout a week to move your VO2 max up? And the number surprises a lot of people when I talk to them about how low this actually is. It's about 3 to 8 minutes total in zone 5 per week is enough to tangibly increase your VO2 max. So in that 4x4 example, let's say you're going really hard for 4 minutes. Maybe the last minute is kind of above that zone 5 where you're feeling like I'm very winded. If you do that 4 times, you might get 4 total minutes from that. That'd be enough. One session of 4x4 per week is going to be enough to increase your VO2 max. But you could surely come at that from a different angle and split that into even 1 minute on, 1 minute off, and do that twice a week. And you might still accumulate a similar amount of time in the high intensity zone to move your VO2 max. So part of this, I think that 4x4 protocol is great. I like to do that myself. Depending on an athlete's training age and their current fitness levels, there's other ways to modify that. But the idea of that kind of 1-to-1 work to rest ratio, pushing yourself to a pretty hard effort is generally where I would start for building VO2 max.
What you just said, I want to underscore it. First, it is something like there is no fixed formula, right? It really depends on the person that's sitting across from you. Maybe they're coming off of an injury. Maybe they haven't been active for a year. Maybe, they haven't trained aerobically in a very, very long time. So we can't just suggest, okay, go do 4 minute on, 4 minute off. Like that's probably not even safe, right? So customized and personalized exercise programming and training plans, that's where I think coaches and exercise professionals really come in handy for people, because I've come across a lot of clients of mine who try to, research on their own. And I know with AI and everything, we can look everything up, right? There are benefits to that, but that AI program doesn't know your history, right? And it's probably not customizing your plan based on your health history, on your training history. So that's important to know that, yes, maybe you can start with 30 seconds on. I even sometimes recommend to my clients like a 1-to-2 ratio, like 30 seconds of work, 90 seconds of rest, right? Because I want them to be able to recover fully and then hit the next interval. Wanted to underscore that. But yeah, we have seen in athletes that, yes, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off has been kind of like their go-to gold standard. Another thing I want to highlight that you mentioned, which a lot of people don't realize, is that for everyday professional, okay, everyday 9-to-5er, we are looking at 3 to 8 minutes of very high intensity work over the week, not even for a single day. I'm talking about over the week span. This very recent study, I'm forgetting the school it was performed at, but it's called the 4% study, podcast episode on that you need only 4% of your week's time as VILPA. VILPA is very high intensity intervals. And you can do that if you have a staircase at your work rather than taking the elevator. You can go up and down the staircase. Just make sure you're doing it consistently 2 or 3 times a week. And guess what? You're done. You don't need any more interval training. Your VO2 max will start improving.
Yeah. And it's also reassuring to know that when you're detrained or you haven't trained and you have low aerobic fitness, really you can take a very generalized approach of just getting in any type of cardio, I think will bring your VO2 max up. Now, at the extremes for people that are trained, obviously it's much harder to, and maybe it's helpful to talk about how much can you actually improve your VO2 max. If you start off and you're already well trained, you surely can still see improvements, but the ceiling is quite low for people that are already well trained. But for people that are not trained, to see your VO2 max increase by 15, 20, maybe even 25% in a year is definitely attainable and less hard than you think it would be, just by incorporating either a combination of low intensity, maybe 2 days a week of some low intensity work, maybe 1 day a week of some interval training. For some people that are very low fitness levels, maybe even just 1 day a week of some sort of cardio, you're going to see the number trending up pretty quickly. And yes, I think it doesn't even have to be a structured, timed interval. This can just be finding some bursts of high intensity, as you mentioned, just using the stairs a few times a week and pushing yourself a little bit harder over time and seeing progression is an excellent way to see your VO2 max improve in a way that's also useful to your long-term health.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like the small bursts of just very high intensity that they count. So if you go out with your dog, maybe just start jogging, start starting some jogging intervals there, right? And that would do it. So try to incorporate those high intensity bursts in the activities that you're already doing. You'll have to do them anyways. So why not? Take the stairs. Why not do a few jogging intervals with your dog, right? I think your dog would enjoy it too. So that being said, let's talk about something that you probably are more passionate about, muscular strength and muscle mass. So how does that come into play when we talk about slowing down aging and keeping our body more functional?
Yeah, this is something I'm also very glad to see people becoming more aware of. And this is something that even 10 years ago, there's a certain crowd of people that like this, and most people would kind of write it off as not for them. But now to see everyone I talk to has some understanding of the importance of this in their long-term health. And there's a lot of different ways we can look at this, and I'll give a few that come to mind. I think as I mentioned before, the hardware and software, we know that like an old computer, the software tends to degrade before the hardware. So what I mean by that is your power and speed tend to decline before your muscle mass. So I think that DEXA scan is an excellent way to look at predictive models that are going to influence your long-term health. But if we can add another layer, another vector onto those predictive models and look at how well you can use that muscle, that's where your strength and power become even better predictors for long-term health than just looking at muscle mass alone. So by that, I mean, in a clinic, I might look at your grip strength, but I also might look at your vertical jump or another measure of power to see how fast can you actually produce force, and not just how much force can you produce or how much muscle mass you have. So that's where I'd start. And you can see at the highest level, if we look at champions in these different activities, elite level sprinters, the average age might be low 20s. You might see power lifters and Olympic lifters in their 30s. You could probably even see bodybuilders in their late 30s and 40s. You see endurance athletes even older than that. So it's interesting to see the regression of these qualities at the highest level and know that that's kind of the same fractal or the same pattern that we see in our own decline over time. So me being in my 30s, I feel just as strong as I did in my 20s. But if I was to race myself at 20 years old, 34 years old, I'm probably going to lose that foot race. And that's one thing that I think is important to think about from predictive models, is looking at speed and power. Then the next layer is muscle mass, as you've already alluded to with DEXA scan. We know that muscle is an organ that's responsible for a lot more than just strength. We know that muscle is a storage container for glucose. And as muscle mass declines, we often see that also manifest as issues with managing glucose and having to use more insulin to get glucose into the muscle tissue. We see other systemic issues like insulin resistance and potentially diabetes with decline in muscle mass. So I think it's important to know that muscle is not just an organ that's responsible for strength, but there's a lot of other confounding variables to consider with muscle mass as well.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with you about muscle mass, that muscle is an endocrine organ where, of course, it stores glucose, and then it also helps us dispose of that excessive glucose and increases your insulin sensitivity there. I like to call muscle as our metabolic currency, because if you have low muscle mass, that increases your risk of chronic diseases like hypertension, cholesterol, and especially diabetes, because it's very directly related to insulin resistance and or sensitivity, depending on the health of your muscle mass too. That's all great. And I really am enjoying this trend that we are seeing now, that people are more aware of health of this organ, which is called muscle, not just for aesthetic reasons, but also for health reasons. I think there's also a relationship between having more muscle mass and then also muscle strength because of it. Although there, I know, two different predictors in our exercise science, we look at them at two different metrics. But if someone has both, it also helps them with something very important, which we tend to kind of ignore when we talk about longevity and longevity science, which is preventing falls. Because we start losing, not only do we start losing muscle, and then we have sarcopenia. A lot of elders have sarcopenia because we start losing muscle after the age of 35 at a slow rate. And then after 50, it really accelerates if we are not taking care of our health. It's all preventable. It's all reversible too. But it also increases the risk of falls. And falling down for most older adults has a very high mortality risk. I was talking to this physician yesterday on the podcast, and we were talking about bone mineral density, and we were talking about how hip fractures are primarily, related to a very, very high mortality rate. And part of it is also because you don't have muscle strength, not only just bone, but muscle strength too. If you don't have it, your balance is not good. You're not going to be able to catch yourself. Your muscles are not going to be able to react fast enough, right? So we are talking about that reactivity. So I just wanted to add that to it. Okay, let's talk about movement. We are both movement specialists, and I think that kind of ties into that balance part, right? Balance and posture. It kind of ties everything in. What are we looking at as far as functional movement is concerned? If somebody is listening to our podcast or is listening to us live, and we have a few people who joined us on Instagram here, so they're listening to us, what should they be looking for? What should they be asking if they're going to their practitioner? Okay, hey, I don't know if I move well. Can you do an assessment on me? What should they be aware of?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think movement quality is something that doesn't get as much hype now when we think of these popular predictors for longevity, and we look at VO2 max and strength. But I think that movement quality is the prerequisite to being able to move more. We surely don't want to add strength or speed to dysfunction. And there's a phrase that physical therapist Gray Cook has always used, this term of move well and move often. I think it's important that he says move well first, because if there's compensation or there's limitations in the way you move, and you try to add intensity with a HIIT training or with strength training on top of that, it's often a recipe for, making that problem even worse and potentially setting yourself up for injury. But it is important. I think movement quality is a general term that's looking at your mobility, your stability, and the yin-yang relationship between that. So looking at how well you can control your body through different fundamental movement patterns. So if we're trying to assess this, again, you can take the lens of activities of daily life. Do you have the adequate movement quality to be able to get out of a chair, get off the floor, stand on one leg? That's surely a non-negotiable element of movement quality that we need everyone to have. But then there's also the extremes of those scenarios that you're not prepared for. A friend asks you to come join a sport you've never played before. Do you have the capacity and the movement quality in order to be resilient in the face of something new? So I think those are important lenses if we're thinking about movement quality. we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good enough. We want to make sure you move well enough to start getting a good habit where you're not going to get hurt. You don't need to get so obsessed with everything needing to be perfect all the time. And I think you and I have had this mindset around pursuing mastery and the quality of movement. Like, I've been doing squats for 15 years and I still think there's room to improve my squats. So I think it's an important mindset to have this, like, you're constantly trying to improve the quality of your movements no matter how long you do them. But when I look at movement quality, what I'm looking for is first, obviously, something that's causing pain. Is there a range of motion where you're getting pain or you're obviously very restricted? The next layer to that is I'm looking at compensation. Are you able to do fundamental movements like a squat, a hip hinge, some sort of pushing, some sort of pulling, without feeling like there's obvious compensation that would set you up for injury? And then lastly, I'm looking at lens for optimization. Is there something that's a little asymmetrical, but might not be a problem for 20 or 30 years? If left unchecked, it could be. So that's where we could start to think about these more prehab type warm-up exercises. They're going to improve your movement quality marginally over time.
Absolutely. I tell people all the time, hey, an overhead squat assessment that you can do in your living room at any day and time. And I know that when people are doing it themselves, but maybe they can record it on iPhone. Like, we are always taking selfies and doing all the other stuff with the phones. That they're a great tool for you to be able to actually see that if your knees are caving in, your shoulder, you can lift your arm up high enough. Are they biceps coming in alignment with your earlobes or not? So those are very, that is my golden go-to test. And this is something like an overhead squat, so everybody can do and figure it out, or ask a friend to see, hey, do you think there's something off in the way I squat? Just with your naked eye, like what are you thinking about? Like, what do you see when I squat down like this? And do my heels lift? Oh, I see that all the time. The calves are tight and hamstrings are tight for those patients. So yeah, it kind of like tells us a lot about your movement ability. And we want to do that prehab, just like you mentioned, prior to actually loading the body with weight and then or a bar, and asking someone to do like a back squat with a loaded bar when their heels actually can't touch with a bodyweight squat, right? So that probably wouldn't be fair and wouldn't go well, because you're reinforcing those poor movement patterns at that point. And for endurance athletes, it's even worse because it's a very repetitive activity and you're doing it so many times over. So thanks for sharing that. I really like that. Okay, to close it up, I have a question for you, which is avoiding the slowing down trap. I want to discuss that. And I think society and this just whole, culture where we are at this time, we are often told that aging inherently means just slowing down. So that just means it's a given. Oh, I'm 55 or I'm 60. Well, I'm going to slow down now anyways. But I always challenge my patients, and I was like, okay, I do want to ask Lucas about it. So what is one uncommon belief you have about physical performance in later decades that most people completely disagree with?
Yeah, this is one that I've thought about as well, especially now transitioning from being in the strength and conditioning world to more of the clinical side of exercise. And it's really easy to get so structured and managed with different protocols and with these predictive models. But I think that play, something unstructured, just being in the mindset of a child and just playing in a way that maybe you're not thinking about, like strengthening my glute and I'm raising my lipid level. I think having unstructured play is something that we just don't do very often as adults, but I suspect is very connected to quality aging and healthy aging. So I think even if it's something silly, or if it's just you moving around, rolling around on the ground like a kid, I think they're just finding ways to adopt a mindset of a child, and a sense of play is something that doesn't get talked about enough. And some people disagree because it's much harder to measure this clinically, and there's not longitudinal studies that look at play and look at your health outcomes. But I think that's one that I continue to champion, is going outside and playing when you get the opportunity is a big piece of this puzzle as well.
Absolutely. Oh, I love this. Adding play to your life, right? Just being, and I think it has so many benefits because not only are you going to be physically active, and if you're doing it with people, like with a community, maybe it's, and I know I keep on giving running example that I need to get over the running group, and or maybe a pickleball. I think that's where pickleball became very popular, right? Because people were going out and playing with other people, right? And it's more like it's childlike activity. Most people haven't played like a ball game like that or a racket game like that since their high school years, right? So they're like, oh my gosh, this is so much fun. I can be actually competitive, like in a friendly way with other people and enjoy this activity too. So yeah, if that means just going out to the dog park and, just taking your dog out and walking with a friend there, that's play.
Yeah. I think it's something you get lost in. I mean, 2 hours go by and you're like, wow, if I was just on a treadmill for 2 hours, I might be so bored or ready to give up and thinking about when is this going to be over. But getting yourself in some sort of playful activity that, surely is still promoting exercise and health benefit, but something that you feel like you look forward to and is fun. It's so easy now for us to think of these things as like chores or to-do lists. Okay, I got to go shopping and do my laundry. Then I need to do my 4x4 protocol. Then I need to do my resistance. It's so easy to get into this, like it's a to-do list thing, and it's hard to build a sustainable long-term behavior change if you're viewing it as a chore. But activities that feel playful and that feel like a sense of recreation or to get your mind in a state of flow, I think those are the things I try to sprinkle in. I clearly there's still value to scientific approaches to these things, but I think having a balance between structured and unstructured movement practices in your day is going to be something that builds a sustainable practice long term.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a great point that you make. And I want to highlight it that bring play back into your life. It's going to also be really good for your mood. It's going to boost your mood, for your mental health, just in general. You're going to get a break from, all the things that we think about, like as adults, right? Thinking about work and thinking about like finances and thinking about grocery shopping and whatnot, right? So it would also give you like a very healthy break from all of that. So rather than, nothing against, binging on Netflix and stuff, like I do it too. But yeah, I think if we could replace some of that with just unstructured play with people you love, that would be great.
Yeah. And you just watch a kid move around, like they might still be watching TV, but they'll be crawling around or rolling or like jumping up and trying to touch things. It's just like this sense of like playfulness to movement, I think is something that I've personally tried to adopt in my own day to day as well. So I might still be watching Netflix at home, but my wife is always asking what I'm doing because I'll be rolling around on the ground or like foam rolling or doing my bear crawls, and she's always laughing at me. But I do think it's like a fun way to still get some variety in my movement in a way that's doesn't feel like work.
Yes, absolutely. And the easier it is, the more you're like into it. You're like, oh, well, it doesn't feel like work. It just makes it easier to execute too. So yeah, that's a great tip. So Lucas, where can our listeners and viewers learn more about you if they want to know about you?
Yeah, I've been trying to be more active on LinkedIn recently, and all the research I've been doing on the clinical side, I'm trying to make this into digestible posts. I actually just recently put up a whole research-based article on bone mineral density. So I'm glad you brought that up, looking at should you lift heavy or should you jump or should you do a combination? And I try to post weekly about these concepts that are popular and try to give scientific evidence behind it too, and take all the research I'm doing and put it into something digestible for people. So I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, so people can find me on there. Maybe we can include it in the show notes, the link to my handle, but you can just search my name, Lucas Denham, and you'll see my page come up there.
Awesome. That's great. And actually, since you mentioned the ways to increase bone mineral density, and there are so many different ways to go about it. Like, of course, we know that strength training is one, but that's one of the things, like the protocols we didn't go too much into protocols, but I'm going to send you the interview that I did with Dr. Fogelberg yesterday. And we talked a lot about like what we are looking at, like diagnostically, and then when to take action and whatnot. But we didn't go too much into the protocols because I think there's so much out there. And there can be different things that work for different people. So you just extended yourself an invite to a follow-up interview. So I would love to chat with you about it sometime, because I think, again, a lot of people are DMing me about these things. And I'm like, honestly, like without your history, I can't tell you, but it's something people are looking for. They're like, okay, we want to learn, okay, what are the options A, B, C, D? And then where can I start and start trying something? So that's great that you're already putting some educational content out there. I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you so much for your time today, Lucas. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure, and I'm happy to chat anytime, so we can dive into these things as deep as we want. And it's really awesome to connect with another physiologist that has a strength and conditioning background, and it's really fun to draw the parallels between what we've done with athletes and what we do with aging people. So thank you so much for inviting me on the show.
Absolutely, Lucas. This was so much fun. And yes, I always enjoy talking to other exercise professionals too. And yes, having an athletic background myself, I'm always like, oh, okay, I also want to talk to someone about it, because yeah, this was so good. Thank you again. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Bye for now.